right, we're in 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2. We finished looking at the text of verses 3 through 17 last week. And so where we want to pick up is dealing with an application on each side of these sections. And then we'll move into what is definitely the most difficult section in the book. A lot of things to discern, and I don't know that it's necessarily, let me take that back. It's not as difficult as people have made it. What's difficult is trying to undo a lot of thoughts and images we have in our heads based upon misunderstandings of the text. So, all right. So in verses 3 through 6 of chapter 2, he puts an emphasis on obedience, you remember. By this we know we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. And so we talked about the simple things. And that's what John is doing, returning back to fundamentals and simple things, one of which is obeying God. Okay? Now, obedience to God, works, these are things that are hotly debated topics many times. Let's see. I was reading today on something. How did he put this? We have a tendency as human beings, and I would go get the book out of my office, but I can't because it's at home. But we have this tendency as human beings to go to extremes in our understandings and to be reactionary. Okay? And what that means, in essence, is we overcorrect. So you say you're driving your car down the road, you take your eyes off for just a second and look back up and you realize that you're starting to deviate off the road. What is the tendency that a lot of people have? You panic and you jerk the wheel and you overcorrect, and that's where a lot of wrecks happen, right? Okay, spiritually speaking, people do the same thing. When a subject is misunderstood, when it is abused, when it is misrepresented, and it takes foothold and it is used to harm people, when people come along to correct it, many times they overcorrect. And it ends up creating two camps where neither one of them are right. And that's the problem, okay? And so everybody wants you to say, you've either got to pick this one or you got to pick this one. And really reality, where truth is usually somewhere in between the two of them. Because they've each are deviations, they're overcorrections. Now I bring that up because when we deal with obedience in religion or works, in Protestant evangelical circles, a lot of this is fueled by the reformer Martin Luther. Okay? Luther was a Catholic monk. He did not set out to start some worldwide movement when he did what he did with his 95 Theses weren't saying, I'm taking down the Catholic Church. That's not what he was about. His 95 Theses were about, these are some things we need to discuss amongst ourselves as Catholics and how we can work through them. But anyway, in the progress of things that happened over his lifespan, Luther had this hatred of anything that smacked of obedience, that even went so far as to, in his translation of Romans 3, when it says a person is justified by faith, he went so far as to add the word only in his translation, his German translation. Okay? The only problem is he added the word. There is no Greek word in that verse that communicates works. Okay? And so he makes this addition. And this has led to, and this is where you get to what was known by the reformers as sola fide. You have 5 solas of the Reformation. Sola is an Italian word or is a Latin term for only. And so when you get to sola fide, or justification by faith alone, Luther's understanding of it is that if you do anything, that means you're contributing to your salvation and justification before God. And that is still prevalent today. That understanding is still as prevalent in the minds of people as it was over the last couple of centuries. It has been, because Luther has imprinted that upon the theology of so many people. For an example, when we discuss the nature of baptism, a lot of people will buck up against baptism being for the remission of sins because they say, well, you're earning something. You're working for something. Why does that rub them such the wrong way? Because in their minds, the way Luther has trained that entire school of thought is, any action you do would mean that you therefore earned it, and you can't earn anything before God. The only problem is Luther completely misunderstood. Okay? Luther was overcorrecting something that at the time was being abused by people. And that was, they were teaching at that time. I'm not a Catholic expert, but you study their writings from that time, you know what they were teaching at that time. Okay? And in the European area where he was, that's what they were teaching, this justification by works. And so he ran to the opposite extreme and said, therefore, you got to take everything out of it. Okay? No works can be involved in any way. Obedience, it's important, but it's not necessarily, well, to be honest with you, it's really hard to nail down. When you read their writings extensively, it's really kind of an elusive game. Okay? And I say this with every bit of respect, and I think you know that. Every bit of respect for the evangelical world. Okay? I'm not saying that they are dumb. I'm not saying that they are purposefully out here trying to miscommunicate something. I just fundamentally disagree with what they're saying. Okay? The same way they would fundamentally disagree with what I'm saying. Okay? So, that leads then to this kind of, anytime you talk about obeying God, we kind of have this tendency, and even in churches of Christ, we have really struggled with this. I was reading about this some this week and looking at our history and how people struggled and how people in the church overcorrected in communicating works. And that sometimes we say something like this: if you want to be saved, there's God's part and then there's man's part. Look, I get what we're trying to say, but it's not necessarily the best way to say it. Okay? It's not necessarily the best way to say it. Because if a person is saved, it's wholly the doing of God. We have to understand that. It doesn't matter how many times I do certain things. It doesn't matter how many times I repent or how many times I'm baptized. If God doesn't come to us in the form of Jesus and bear our penalties, we can do those things for the rest of our lives and we'll be as lost can be. Salvation is accomplished by God. Okay? Salvation is God. The parts that sometimes we have tried to elevate to the works of God are our works of obedience and submission to Him. I have a problem with us saying you got God's part and you got man's part. No, you got God's part and then you got man receiving what God has done. And that people say that's not really that's kind of subtle. No, it isn't. It's actually monumental in its difference. Okay? And the reason why in our history we have put those two things on that level is we fundamentally disagreed with how people received Jesus. And so we began to overemphasize man's response to the gospel and underemphasize what God has done. Let me illustrate this. So, classically in churches of Christ, and most of them that we've grown up in, sermons, regardless of the subject, end how? With an invitation And we say, give them the gospel plan of salvation, which we mean is what? Come on, we've all learned the five-finger thing. Confess and be baptized. Look, I'm not knocking that, but you do know that we developed that, right? We developed breaking it down into its constituent parts. That's Elias Smith. Okay? So when we end every sermon and we say, look, if you want to be saved, you've got to hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. What is a part we are completely ignoring if we only talk about those five things? Okay? Live faithfully, but ultimately you've left God out of the equation. We didn't mean to. We weren't trying to communicate when we said that God had nothing to do with us being saved. But what I'm telling you is that over the years, people began to understand it that way. And I'm not bashing anybody. I'm just saying you have to assess reality as you see it. Okay? So, does obedience play a part in what it means to be saved, what it means to be a Christian? The answer is yes. Obedience is a part of the Christian life. There's no way to read the New Testament and say obedience is basically of zero importance. There's no way you can read it and say works don't play in any way. There's no type of work that's discussed, because there are all types of works that are discussed in the New Testament. Right? You can't read the New Testament without seeing the Word. So, when it comes to obedience, how do we thread the needle and avoid communicating things the Bible doesn't communicate, or even, let me take that back, not even communicating things the Bible doesn't communicate, overemphasizing certain points of the Bible to the neglect of others? How do we go about threading that needle? That's the real challenge, right? And the answer comes, and this is what has led to many people, in my experience in the last few years in ministry, this is what has led many people to struggle in churches of Christ, because, of course, that's my experience. I've never preached for anyone else. It has led people to struggle because you will hear them say things, well, I don't know if I'm doing enough. How do I know if I'm going to heaven? I don't know if I'm doing enough. Listen, you can't do enough. You got to come to accept that. You don't earn your way. You don't pay God back. That's not how this works. Obedience springs from the fact of an overflow of gratitude for God. Listen to the way one writer put it. When we have discovered God's inexhaustible love for us, we love Him utterly. And this is expressed tangibly in obedience to His will. Okay? We are moved by His love, which moves us to submit to Him. So, let me see if we can illustrate it this way. So there was a marriage counselor who was trying to explain something in one of the books he was writing. And he said, growing up, I hated vacuuming the floors. Like, I vowed that when I got out on my own, I would never vacuum the floors. I would pay somebody. Hopefully, I could talk my wife into it, whatever. He said, but what have I done since the day I've gotten married? He said, I vacuum the floors. Because the only person who hates it more than I do is my wife. You see, he's doing something because a love for another person has driven him to change the way he sees and what he does. And that's the way it is with God. When we are moved by who He is, it changes the way, listen, you can learn what you need to know about a Christian by hearing how they talk about commands from God. Some people are still spiritually teenagers. Oh, you just don't want me to have fun. Come on, it's time to grow up. Rules are not about keeping people from fun. Rules are about keeping people safe and about allowing them to enjoy an abundant life. That's what they're about. And so our obedience springs from gratitude. This is why Ephesians 2, when he discusses justification, he says, we weren't saved by works, that is, works by which we have earned our way to God. That's communicated in Romans 4 as well. But he said, we were created for good works. Not saved by them, but for them. And so understanding and kind of untangling that web is essential. And I will be honest, it's incredibly difficult to thread that needle. And it's a constant balance of looking at it and saying, am I doing what I'm doing because I expect God to pay me back for this? Or am I doing what I'm doing because I love God? So we have to be cautious in our obedience. We don't need to shy away from obedience. We don't need to shy away from submitting to God. John very plainly says here, you want to know how you can know you're different than the false teachers amongst you? You obey God and they don't. They claim they know God, but they won't do anything he says. So then, we come alongside brotherly love for just a minute. And so when we talked about this was a couple of weeks ago, we talked about brotherly love and the challenge of it, because the reality of it is this. We are people and we are very different. And we're going to do things that hurt each other, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. People say, that's not the way it should be. You're right. In a land of fairies and bunnies, that's right. It's not supposed to be that way. But this is the real world, a sinful, fallen world, and we do the wrong thing. And sometimes we knowingly do the wrong thing. I'm sorry, am I being a little too honest? That's what happens. If you come to church expecting it to be perfect and that your differences in personalities and differences in upbringings and differences in views of the world aren't going to rub up against each other, you're setting yourself up for massive disappointment. And so what we have many times is people who are harboring old disputes and feuds. And I'm not naive enough. There are some people who in the name of forgiveness are just flat out ridiculous. They understand, they really in my mind communicate nothing about, that they know nothing about forgiveness, how complex and difficult it is. However, the way one writer puts it, the command to love is a command to work at relationships that have gone wrong. Listen to him again. The command to love is the command to work at relationships that have gone wrong. All right? We're two Christians. We've had our differences. We tried to do some things on the front end. It wasn't going anywhere, so we stepped away for a while. But we're going to come back to it again. We're going to work, and then we're going to step away from it a while. And the point is that we're always looking toward reconciliation. Now, that's not an excuse for a person to say, yeah, I'm still working on it. You know, that kind of sly, funny thing people like to do, smart alecky. Yeah, I'm still working on it. No, you're not. Don't make a mockery of the things of God by something like that. Actually work on it. Work on yourself. Work on your own heart. Pray for the bitterness that resides in your own heart. Pray for eyes to see that this is a person made in the image of God for whom Christ died. And that has to affect the way that I view them. It has to affect the way that I interact with them. Even though we're not going to be as close as we were at this moment, it can help me begin to build bridges back. But then the third thing is this, and it's also under the idea of brotherly love. Actually, no, it's not. It's under love for God. But in this context, you remember in verses 12 through 16, or 12 through 14, he talks about and addresses three groups of people: children, fathers, and young men. Okay? Children, fathers, and young men. So you've got different maturity levels, we'll call it that, in Christianity. Okay? Different maturity levels. Is there anybody that doesn't look back on things they did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or even, there's rarely a Sunday that goes by that I don't sit down and go, what in the world did I just say? Like that could have been done a whole lot better. Right? Who doesn't look back on? The point being is that hopefully, and listen, if you can't do that, if you can't look at your life and see progression, you're not growing. It's a telltale sign. You're not growing. So you get to different developing stages of faith. And when you see a lot of internal church struggles, what are a lot of them? Well, I'm just going to quote the statements. Well, you know, the old people, they don't want to spend any money. And they don't want to change nothing. These young people, they just want to be entertained. What John is describing in these different relationships is something we need to understand. So in my second preaching job, there was a guy, and this is no exaggeration, you can ask Brooke, zero exaggeration. Every sermon and every class, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, after every sermon and every class, he met me at the back door with the things that I had said wrong according to him. Now, I was young and immature, and I took it personally, and I went through a number of different things. But you know what? At the end of the day, I needed him. I needed him. Do I think he was wrong most of the time in what he said? Yeah, I thought he was. But there were also times when he was right. And what if I'd never had anybody speak up and say anything? You see, even that cantankerous complainer probably don't want to do without them. They do bring perspective. I'm not saying you got to agree with them all the time. I'm not saying, but they bring perspective. They bring a point of consideration. Okay? It's like the comedian Nate Bargatze says, it's almost like this in marriage. You know, you've got the free spender and then you've got the tightwad, right? You can't both be free spenders or you'd be broke in less than an hour, okay? Like, I'm the free spender. I'll just tell you straight up, okay? And people say, well, which one is right? Well, usually it depends upon which one you are. That's how you see it. But the truth of the matter is that neither of you are. Tightwad needs to learn to let go, and free spender needs to learn discipline. And the only way you're going to do that is when you marry each other, and now you're forced to confront it. Okay? In churches, people say, well, somebody did something that I didn't like, so I upped and I left. I certainly hope we don't treat our relationships that way. We need these different faith stages in the midst of congregations for a reason. People say, you've got churches where people are older, you've got churches where people are younger, you've got churches where people are middle-aged. Yeah, that's a good thing. That's called health. You need people at every stage. You need kids who can look up at a person who, to them, you know how a kid is, right? If a person is 60, they're 1,000 years old in their mind. But they need to know that that older individual cares about them. And as a parent, I need to teach my children that that older individual has value, even though they can't do the things that they once did. You're here today because of what they've done. They're not in your way, you're standing on their shoulders. You gotta understand that and appreciate that about each other. Sometimes as we get older, we can get more cynical. When we're younger, a lot of times we can be really naive. What's the answer? Put them in a room together and get them to figure out a solution that both can live with. You'll probably come out with a pretty well-reasoned solution. The point is, no Christian can look at another in a local church and say, I don't need you. Because you do. Every person in this room, you know plenty of things that I need to know and I don't know. And until we can view each other that way, along with many other ways, we're going to look at each other as dispensable. And so we have to be extremely cautious and understanding our differences and respecting those differences and respectfully voicing our differences toward one another. All right? Any questions or anything along those lines before we move into this? Well, that's not what I wanted to do. This next section. All right. So in this section, we're looking at warnings. And this section is extremely, we're going to have to spend a lot of time probably on about 2 or 3 terms and understanding those terms and removing ideas that we have associated with words. Okay? So what I want to do, let's read verses 18 through 25 just to kind of get the paragraph in front of us, and then we will spend our time, the rest of our time probably in 18 and 19. He says, "Children, it is the last hour. As you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out, that it might become plain that they all are not of us. But you have been anointed by the Holy One, and you have all knowledge. I write to you not because you do not know the truth, but because you know it, and because no lie is of the truth. Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever confesses the Son has the Father also. Let what you heard from the beginning abide in you. If what you heard from the beginning abides in you, then you too will abide in the Son and in the Father. And this is the promise which he has made us, eternal life." Okay. So, there are multiple things here. The first 2 that I want us to think through are probably pretty obvious. This phrase, last hour, and Antichrist. And there are a whole lot of notions that are attached to these things. Okay? And I will say that the notions that are attached to these things are at a popular level. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So at a popular level, if you go into a bookstore, if you go into Barnes & Noble, you go into the Christian section, you're going to find books there that are available to the general public. Okay? That's where the general public, when they want to buy a book on something, they go to a large retail bookstore. Okay? But here's the thing. So there are standards of publishing at the general retail bookstore level. Okay? There are standards of publishing. But you got to remember some of the standards in retail publishing are also about making money. The rigorous fact checking. Many times you've got to go to academic presses, the ones you don't know anything about. You got to go to places who have standards. You can't just write, well, you know, I think this happened, and you don't have to have a list of footnotes or a list of endnotes at the end of a chapter showing that I'm not just making this up out of thin air. I actually have to have tangible primary or secondary sources to say this. And it has to go through a board of editors who are not only going to check my reasoning, but also check my sources. Because you're not just publishing something to make money, you're publishing something to contribute to the intellectual discussion of things that are going on, whatever your subject is. So, I say that to say this. Most of the stuff that you and I will see at a popular level, which is where most people are ever going to see it. I don't expect people to know what academic presses are for religious studies, okay? I don't expect anybody to know that. So we go on what we see most often. And what we see most often is in a bookstore or somebody that can afford a popular spot on a television or can use social media and can get their understanding of things out. Okay? Now, when you go there, what you will find is most commonly what we know as dispensational premillennialism. Okay? There are different forms of premillennialism. Premillennialism was a big issue in churches of Christ for at least a century. But basically, dispensational premillennialism is what you see whenever there's a war in the Middle East or when COVID was out, you've got all your conspiracies coming together, right? This is the sign of the end of the time. This is the final plague. This is the this. This is the that. This person is the Antichrist. This is the lawless one. This is, okay. That's what most people see. And I don't mean it disrespectfully. But in the world where the Bible is studied at an extremely critical level, those notions that are published out in public are not even considered. They're not considered. There are still a few schools and there are still a few scholars that will promote it, but they don't even consider it. They have seen through it. Okay? Now, why do I say that? Well, when you hear the word Antichrist, what comes to your mind? Devil, all kinds of stuff. This guy is going to rise up at the end of time. In dispensationalism, he's going to be a great political leader. He's going to lead. He's going to be the one that causes the great tribulation, and then he and Jesus are going to get into a war, and Jesus is going to kill him and then set up on David's throne, and all this type of stuff. And he's going to the temple in Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt. He's going to sit on the throne in the temple. He's going to do all kinds of wild things. And he's compared to, when we studied Daniel, and I talked to you about Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes ad nauseum, well, he's the precursor to the Antichrist in this way of thinking. In Matthew 24, when people think Jesus is talking about the end of the world, or when the people think when they think Jesus is giving signs to predict the end of the world, he's not giving signs to predict the end of the world. He's giving signs to predict the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. But they take Matthew 24 and Mark 13, and they pile it in with this. And then you take 2 Thessalonians 2 with the man of lawlessness, and you see that's the Antichrist. Now, there's no verbal connection. They're all called different things in those contexts, but magically we can pour them in a bowl and mix them around, and they all come out as the same person. Not how it works. Revelation 13, the beast that comes up from the earth, or from the water and from the earth. You have two different beasts that rise. People take these things and they make them so fanciful. So the challenge is this. How do I take all of those images and all of those notions and all of that stuff I've heard and set it to the side and say, what is the evidence? Well, they list Bible verses. Listen, I can list you 1,000 Bible verses. It doesn't prove anything. Listing verses proves nothing. It's understanding them. So the question I'm trying to get us to is, so what does the evidence actually say? This is one thing I want you to learn, I want all of us to learn how to do. Somebody asserts something. This is the way it is. The first question you need to ask yourself in your mind, I'm not saying be difficult, I'm not saying argue with people all the time, I'm saying think critically. The first thing you need to ask in your mind is, how do you know that? How do you know that? I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm asking you to tell me how you know it. And when we learn to do that, we no longer need other people in their books to tell us what things are saying. They're helpful. They're good to consider. But we can actually take the text ourselves and just compile evidence. All right, so let's take this phrase. He says, children, this is his way of addressing them, and all throughout this particular letter, the tender affection that he shares for them as the older apostle and younger, probably third-generation Christians. He says, it is the last hour. So what is the last hour? What does it mean? When you and I hear that as an American, if you heard that in some other context and we said it's the last hour, how would we understand it? We're winding this thing down, right? Last 60 minutes. Like for us, when we hear hour, we are using it many times pretty literally. And so when we come, this is the challenge. We're reading a book that's a couple thousand years old. And so we read the last hour and we're like, oh, the last hour. Whew. It's winding down, isn't it? This is close. But what does the last hour really mean? Is it used anywhere else? 1 John is actually the only place you'll find this phrase. It's the only place. You see, you can make a big deal. Oh, this is the last hour. Listen, you don't even need Bible software. Just do Google. Last hour in the Bible. Pretty quick. So then, when I find out that last hour is this is the only place in the New Testament where last hour is even used. The only place it's used. That tells me, listen, we should immediately be suspicious of somebody who wants to concoct a whole idea out of a sentence or a phrase that's about that long. Oh, Revelation 20, it's the millennium, it's the 1,000-year reign. Well, if when you listen to people talk about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, they write books on it. John wrote an entire book, and you know how much space he gave it? That much. If I'm writing thousands of pages on something he gave that much attention to, alarm bells need to be going off in my head saying, maybe I'm just overcomplicating this. So we think about the word hour, okay? So when we're studying this out, and yes, I'm doing that annoying thing where I'm walking you through the processes. I'm not giving you the cheat code and just telling you, okay? Because I want us to learn. I don't do this often, but I know I do it, and I know it's annoying, but there's a reason I do it. So nowhere else except in 1 John do I find last hour, okay? So my next thought then, as I begin to research it, is this the only book John ever wrote? No. He wrote 2 John, 3 John, Gospel of John, Revelation. So then I began asking myself, okay, if last hour is nowhere else, does John use the term hour? H-O-U-R. Does he use that word a lot? Yep. A whole bunch. In John's gospel, there is this focus on Jesus saying, my hour has not yet come. The hour is coming and now is, when true worshipers worship the Father in spirit and truth. The hour is coming when all of you will forsake me and I will be left alone, yet I'm not alone because the Father is with me. Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, and having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, John 13:1. What I'm learning is when I look at the way John is using the word hour, John uses the word hour to describe something critical. And so when I take that understanding and I come back to 1 John chapter 2 and he says last hour, I can tell myself what I'm dealing with is something that's pretty significant. It may not be what people are making it out to be, but it is pretty significant. Okay? So then outside of that, after I've looked at everything John has written, I begin to ask myself, are there other phrases that are not exactly this, but similar? And the answer is yes. What are some other phrases you see in the Bible that sound similar to last hour? Okay? What's that? The time has come. Okay? What else? The end of all things. Last days is very prevalent. Okay? For an example, last times, 2 Peter 1:20, last days, Acts 2:17, Hebrews 1:2, and there's a whole bunch of it. And that depends on your translation. Sometimes they render it differently. The prophets speak of the last days, Isaiah 2:2. It shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house will be established on top of the mountains. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11, all these things happen to them, and they are examples to us upon whom the ends of the ages have come. You see, now we've just made this thing a lot broader. And people say, man, this is boring. Yeah, I do it every day, believe me. It's not boring to me, though. I find it extremely fascinating and interesting. But it's also why I tend to get a little annoyed when somebody says the Bible's really simple. Yeah, I don't think so. If the Bible were so simple, then why wouldn't people understand it so easily? It takes work. So, in fast forwarding ahead so we can finish this discussion of last hour. Last hours, last days, these are phrases that are used in the Old and New Testament to describe that this is the final act in the history of the world. Okay? So think about it this way. It's like going to a play and it has different parts in it, and you have intermissions in the different parts of your plays, right? And so you have Act 1, and then you have a break. And then Act 2, and then you've got a break. And then they say, please find your seat. The final act is about to begin. That's the way biblical writers are using this. It doesn't mean that the time of the end of the world is right about to happen, like 2 seconds from now, although it could. Okay? The way they're using it is, you've got sin, you've got the nation of Israel, you've got all these developments in Act 1. You've got the ministry of Jesus, his justification, his resurrection, all these things in Act 2. The first coming of Jesus. And now we're in the final act. And we're awaiting the second coming of Jesus to wind everything up. And everything will be finished. And so John says, it's the last hour. This is the final stage. God doesn't have another stage, another act to implement. So when this act ends, the play is over. Now, doesn't that sound a whole lot different than saying that COVID, end of the world? Makes a whole lot more sense. Okay? So was the Spanish flu, and so was the Antichrist going to be Mikhail Gorbachev, and so was it Saddam Hussein, and so was it the Pope, and so was it the Reformers, and so was it... Everything will start to make a lot more sense, I hope. So we'll pick up there next week looking at Antichrist and thinking through that a little bit.